Imagine a moment so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it could easily be swallowed by the mundane hum of bureaucracy. A quiet courtroom, the rustle of papers, the hushed whispers of legal proceedings, but sometimes it's precisely in these unassuming moments that the tectonic plates of culture shift and a single act of conviction ignites a wildfire. This is the story of such a moment, a confrontation that wasn't just about a necklace, but about the very soul of freedom in America. Get ready, because what you're about to read will challenge your assumptions and stir your spirit. And if this story resonates with you, do us a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more untold truths, and drop a comment below. Your engagement helps us bring these vital narratives to light. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, a quiet bureaucratic process unfolding in the sterile confines of a California courtroom. The air, thick with the hushed reverence typically afforded to judicial proceedings, promised nothing more than a methodical discussion of local regulations. Yet, an undercurrent of something far more profound was about to ripple through the room. Karoline Leavitt, poised and purposeful, was scheduled to speak. Her mission, to represent a non-profit organization challenging a local regulation that, in their view, subtly but surely encroached upon the space for faith-based symbols in public institutions. Dressed in a sharp white blazer that spoke volumes of her professionalism and an unyielding calm, Karoline entered the courtroom. Her stride was firm, her gaze direct, betraying no hint of the seismic event about to occur. Just above the crisp collar of her blazer, a silver cross pendant glinted softly, a quiet declaration of her identity and beliefs, seemingly an innocuous detail in the grand scheme of legal formalities. The moment she took her seat at the witness bench, the quiet hum of the courtroom began to shift. It started subtly, a low murmur that spread like a ripple across a still pond. Court officers exchanged quick, knowing glances. The bailiff, usually impassive, glanced up from his clipboard, his brows subtly furrowed. And then, as if on cue, the presiding judge, Edward M. Chen, a figure of stern authority, peered over his glasses. His brows were deeply furrowed, not in concentration, but in a visible irritation that seemed to emanate from him like a palpable force. "Miss Leavitt," he began, his voice cutting through the murmurs, clipped and devoid of warmth. "Remove the necklace, or you will be held in contempt." Karoline's expression didn't waver. Her composure remained absolute, a testament to a conviction far deeper than mere defiance. Her voice, calm and steady, filled the sudden silence. "It's a symbol of my faith, Your Honor." Judge Chen leaned forward, his irritation hardening into something more akin to a challenge. "This is a secular courtroom. Your personal beliefs are not on trial, but your defiance might be." That was the precise moment the air in the room shifted, crackling with an unspoken tension. Unbeknownst to many, cameras from 3 local news outlets were rolling quietly in the back, capturing every charged second. With an almost unnerving calm, Karoline slowly placed her hands flat on the bench, her gaze locked with the judge's. "With all due respect, Judge Chen," she responded, her voice gaining a quiet strength, "your courtroom is in the United States of America, where the First Amendment protects my right to speak freely and live my faith." Without a pause, as if her words were a direct affront, Judge Chen slammed down the gavel. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. $1,000 fine. "Next morning, you'll be escorted out." Gasps rippled across the room. The media stirred, their cameras now more active, and in that moment, as the shock reverberated, Karoline Leavitt smiled. It wasn't a smile of arrogance, nor of amusement. It was a subtle, knowing smile of strategy. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, headlines were already forming, and social media began to explode. The spark had been struck. The fire was about to ignite. The gavel's echo had barely faded from the California courtroom, yet its reverberations were already shaking the foundations of the national conversation. Karoline Leavitt's subtle, knowing smile, witnessed by a handful of reporters, was the quiet prelude to a storm. Outside the courthouse that very afternoon, the initial tremors began. Local news vans, sensing a story far larger than a routine hearing, scrambled to file their reports. Within hours, headlines were not just forming. They were exploding across digital platforms. Social media, the ultimate accelerant of modern narratives, caught fire. Hashtags like #HerCrossOnTrial and #CarolineVision started trending, not just locally, but nationally, fueled by a collective sense of outrage and solidarity. The incident, once confined to a quiet bureaucratic process, had become a public spectacle, but Karoline Leavitt wasn't done. Her strategy, as deliberate as her composure in the courtroom, was just beginning to unfold. That very night, she stepped onto a national television stage, not as a victim, but as a beacon. The silver cross, the very symbol Judge Chen had sought to banish, glinted defiantly against her white blazer as she held it up for the world to see. Her voice, calm yet imbued with an unwavering conviction, resonated across millions of living rooms. "They want you to believe that faith is a threat," she declared, her gaze piercing the camera lens. "What they really fear is conviction." This wasn't merely about her personal plight, it was a rallying cry. It was about the millions watching who had been told to sit down, stay quiet, and tuck their beliefs out of sight. Karoline had just drawn a line in the sand, a clear demarcation between individual liberty and institutional overreach. By morning, the courthouse incident had transcended local news to become a national flashpoint. Every major cable news outlet, from the most conservative to the most progressive, ran clips of Judge Chen's curt order and Karoline's unyielding response. Conservative commentators, quick to seize upon the narrative, hailed her as a modern-day Joan of Arc, a courageous figure standing against secular tyranny. Progressive pundits, caught off guard, scrambled to explain why a federal judge had seen fit to fine someone over a necklace, struggling to reconcile the optics with their usual discourse. Judge Chen, a man accustomed to the insulated quiet of his chambers, usually shielded from the harsh glare of the spotlight, found himself thrust into the uncomfortable position of being the reluctant face of judicial overreach. His spokesperson, in an attempt at damage control, issued a bland, sterile statement. The judge's ruling was grounded in preserving courtroom decorum and neutrality, but the public, already inflamed by Karoline's powerful message, wasn't buying it. The carefully constructed legal jargon fell flat against the emotional resonance of a woman fined for her faith. Meanwhile, Karoline, ever the strategist, wasted not a single moment. The invitations poured in: Fox News, Newsmax, even a few liberal-leaning podcasts, eager to capture the burgeoning controversy, sought her out. She accepted, not to apologize, not to retreat, but to double down. Sitting with the same perfect composure, the cross still prominently visible against her white blazer, she made it unequivocally clear: this was no mere PR stunt. This was a fight she hadn't asked for, but one she was absolutely ready to win. "If my necklace offends a federal judge," she stated, her voice steady and chillingly calm, "imagine how he treats citizens who don't have cameras behind them." That single line, delivered with such quiet power, got over 5 million views in 24 hours. The fire, ignited by a single gavel strike, was now raging, fueled by conviction and a nation's growing frustration. The echoes of Karoline Leavitt's national television appearances, particularly that chillingly calm question about citizens without cameras, resonated far beyond the cable news studios. Behind the scenes, the legal world, often slow to react to public sentiment, began to mobilize with unprecedented speed. Conservative legal groups, long advocating for religious liberties, saw in Karoline's case a clear, undeniable violation. Constitutional law experts, from ivory towers to bustling law firms, issued open letters that condemned Judge Chen's fine not merely as an error, but as a direct, egregious violation of First Amendment protections. The legal arguments were sharp, precise, and amplified by the roar of public opinion. A prominent senator, sensing the shifting political winds, called for a formal ethics investigation into Judge Chen's conduct. Congressional offices, usually inundated with routine constituent mail, began to flood with petitions demanding the judge's resignation. The seemingly small act of fining a woman for a necklace had awakened a sleeping giant, but Karoline Leavitt, ever strategic, didn't stop at media tour. She understood that while public opinion was powerful, legal precedent was paramount. With the momentum building, she made a pivotal announcement: she would file a federal complaint against the judge. This wasn't just for her own sake, she declared. It was to establish a legal precedent, a bulwark protecting religious expression in all federal courtrooms across the nation. In a fiery speech delivered from the Capitol steps to a cheering crowd that stretched as far as the eye could see, she amplified her message. "I'm not just defending a necklace," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with conviction. "I'm defending the millions who are tired of being told their faith is a threat to democracy." The image of her, poised and resolute against the backdrop of the nation's capital, became instantly iconic. As supporters rallied around her, their voices swelling into a unified roar, Judge Chen faced an increasingly uncomfortable reality. His courtroom decision, once a matter of judicial decorum, was no longer just a legal dispute. It had morphed into a full-blown cultural battlefield. And Karoline Leavitt, the young woman he had tried to silence, had just become the general leading the charge. The next 72 hours unfolded like a political earthquake. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just trending, she was dominating the national conversation. Talk radio hosts invoked her name with reverence, her story becoming a new parable of courage. College students, inspired by her defiance, printed her photo onto t-shirts. Conservative pastors played clips of her courthouse moment during Sunday sermons, transforming it into a modern-day sermon illustration. Yet, inside the insulated world of the political establishment, the tone was far more tense. In Washington, D.C., whispers filled the marble corridors of the Capitol. Judiciary aides scrambled to draft legal memos, attempting to navigate the treacherous waters of public backlash. Judge Chen's team, unaccustomed to such intense public scrutiny, held emergency meetings, desperately trying to contain a narrative that had already spiraled beyond their control. But it was too late. The spark Karoline had struck, the indelible image of a calm, poised woman fined for wearing a symbol of faith, had ignited something deep and volatile within the American psyche. It was no longer just about Karoline, it was about them, the silent millions who felt their faith was being pushed to the shadows, their convictions sidelined in the name of a misguided neutrality. Meanwhile, Karoline, refusing to back down or soften her tone, took to the stage at a student leadership summit. She wore the same white blazer, the same silver cross, but this time, she was not behind a witness bench. She was behind a podium, and the crowd roared at her first words. "A judge tried to find my faith. I say, let the world see it shine." The audience erupted. She laid out the events not as a personal grievance, but as a pattern, drawing a straight line from schools silencing prayers to tech platforms censoring scripture-based opinions, culminating in Judge Chen's gavel. And then she dropped the news. She was filing an official lawsuit against the federal judiciary, citing violations of the First Amendment, religious discrimination, and abuse of authority. The legal world exploded. Cable news ran split-screen debates. Legal scholars clashed on air. Even liberal commentators hesitated, asking, was it really okay to punish someone in court for a necklace? Judge Chen, now under immense scrutiny, issued a second statement through court channels. It read like a legal memo, cold, technical, devoid of apology. But Karoline's side had already won the emotional battle. By the fourth day, the lawsuit gained steam. Dozens of prominent lawyers, including former constitutional law professors and former DOJ officials, signed onto the complaint. Religious liberty organizations pledged financial support. Karoline opened an online legal fund that raised over $1.2 million in 36 hours. Even more telling, a wave of people, nurses, teachers, police officers began posting photos of themselves wearing crosses at work with the hashtag #CharFindMeToo. What began as a quiet courtroom exchange had become a national movement. Judge Chen had struck the match. Karoline Leavitt turned it into a wildfire. By the fifth day, Karoline Leavitt wasn't just making headlines, she was setting the national agenda. Political strategists across the spectrum began frantically adjusting their media calendars, recognizing that the Leavitt case was no longer a sidebar, but a central pillar of public discourse. Congressional staffers were instructed to prepare statements, and even presidential hopefuls, during interviews, found themselves cornered with the unavoidable question, where do you stand on the Leavitt case? Karoline wasn't playing defense, she was driving the conversation, a force of nature reshaping the political landscape. On Capitol Hill, she walked with deliberate purpose through the hallowed halls of power, surrounded by a phalanx of cameras and an ever-growing crowd of supporters. She met with senators and House members who once might have considered her too young, too loud, or too unconventional. Now, they listened closely, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. She wasn't begging for support. She was rallying it, her conviction a magnet in a city often devoid of genuine principle. Inside the Russell Senate building, she delivered a brief but utterly unforgettable press statement. Cameras rolled, capturing every nuance of her unwavering resolve. Her voice was steady, resonant, and piercingly clear. When a judge uses his gavel to silence faith, she declared, he's not upholding justice. He's betraying it. This is bigger than me. This is about every citizen told to strip their identity before entering a room of law. The silence that followed her words was louder than the frantic clicking of the cameras. Even seasoned reporters, accustomed to the theatricality of Washington, were left momentarily speechless. Karoline had stopped being a mere guest on talk shows. She had become the story itself. Meanwhile, Judge Chen, whose court calendar was once a monotonous litany of routine and unremarkable cases, found his entire career under official review. A bipartisan group of lawmakers, responding to the overwhelming public outcry, had formally requested a Judiciary Committee inquiry. Federal clerks, emboldened by the unfolding drama, quietly leaked details of his past courtroom behaviors, including other subtle but consistent signs of hostility toward expressions of faith. It was adding up, piece by damning piece, and it wasn't pretty. Chen's dwindling circle of defenders attempted damage control, arguing that his actions were merely an attempt to preserve courtroom neutrality. But every time they tried to justify the fine, another viral clip of Karoline's Capitol speech hit millions of screens, rendering their explanations hollow. Outside the legal and political worlds, something even more profound was brewing. At college campuses and churches across the country, peaceful demonstrations broke out spontaneously. People gathered, not with angry signs, but with crosses pinned conspicuously to their clothing. Some stood silently in front of federal buildings, their presence a quiet but powerful protest. Others carried signs reading, "Faith is not contempt. We are all Karoline." The message was clear. The First Amendment wasn't optional. CNN, often reluctant to cover such grassroots movements, found itself compelled to report on it. MSNBC ran an awkward segment, attempting to reframe the movement, but none could deny its undeniable reach. Karoline had tapped into something raw. Long suppressed the deep frustration of Americans watching institutions slowly sideline belief in the name of order. Then came the call that changed everything. The House Oversight Committee, recognizing the undeniable gravity of the situation, extended an invitation to Karoline. Testify before Congress. She would appear before the nation, not as a protester, not as a pundit, but as a witness in defense of religious liberty. It was no longer just a fight with a single judge. It was about the soul of the system itself, and Karoline Leavitt was going to look that system in the eye, her silver cross shining, an untucked, unapologetic symbol of unwavering conviction. The hearing chamber was packed beyond capacity, a testament to the seismic shift Karoline Leavitt had orchestrated. Marble columns stretched upward, seemingly bracing for history, as staffers leaned against walls and reporters filled every bench. Cameras from every major outlet stood trained on a single wooden table, at which sat Karoline Leavitt, her white blazer crisp under the glow of recessed lights. Around her neck, the silver cross rested, untucked, unapologetic, across from her. Sat members of the House Oversight Committee, some leaning forward with genuine interest, others folding their arms skeptically. At the center, a gavel wielded by the committee chair, whose opening remarks did little to hide the palpable tension in the room. Today's hearing is not about religion nor politics, he began, attempting a facade of neutrality, but for Karoline, it was about both, because the moment Judge Chen fined her, everything had become political. When it was her turn to speak, Karoline rose slowly, deliberately. She didn't use notes, she didn't fumble for words. Her voice was clear, resonant, as if every syllable had been burning in her throat for days, waiting for this moment of release. "I was fined in a federal courtroom for wearing a cross," she stated, her gaze sweeping across the committee members, "not for speaking out of turn, not for contemptuous behavior, for wearing a symbol that millions of Americans wake up with every day." A hush spread through the chamber, so profound you could hear the cameras clicking. "Some here will say this was about maintaining order," she continued, "but I ask, when did our Constitution stop being orderly? When did religious freedom become something to manage instead of protect?" Cameras caught a Democratic congresswoman shifting uncomfortably in her seat. "I didn't walk into that courtroom to start a war. I walked in to testify on behalf of conscience rights. But when that gavel dropped, it didn't silence me. It woke up a nation." As murmurs rippled through the chamber, Karoline delivered the Final, devastating blow. If I can be fined for my necklace, a teacher can be fired for a prayer. A nurse can be disciplined for a Bible verse. This wasn't just a courtroom mistake, it was a warning shot. And I'm here to say we heard it. We're answering. The audience, despite protocol, erupted into thunderous applause. Committee members exchanged looks, some angry, some shaken, but the public had already made up its mind. Clips of Karoline's speech flooded social media within minutes. TikTokers dubbed her America's Iron Voice. Faith groups organized candlelight vigils. Members of Congress who had ignored her now reached out quietly, seeking meetings, and somewhere in a federal building not far away, Judge Edward M. Chen sat in his chambers watching the broadcast. Knowing the woman he tried to silence had just become impossible to ignore, Judge Edward M. Chen sat silently in his chambers, the courtroom echo long gone, replaced now by a deafening silence of consequence. Outside his window, the federal courthouse was no longer just a place of law. Protesters had turned it into a symbol, a ground zero of constitutional reckoning. Inside, the weight of the backlash began to take form. The Judicial Ethics Review Board had received over 75 formal complaints. In less than a week, an unprecedented volume. Attorneys from both political camps had submitted letters questioning Judge Chen's fitness. He'd become the face of institutional overreach, and he knew it. But it wasn't just him feeling the heat. The Department of Justice, already under fire for selective enforcement of religious liberty protections, scrambled to distance itself. The court acted independently, they insisted, but nobody was buying it. The DOJ had allowed it to happen, and the public saw complicity. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt's movement wasn't slowing. It was accelerating. She launched a campaign called Stand with Faith, giving a platform to countless Americans who had faced similar suppressions. Firefighters suspended for devotionals, teachers reprimanded for Bible quotes, students told to remove crosses on field trips. The testimonials poured in. Real stories, real damage, and Karoline read them aloud nightly. In live streams viewed by millions, then came the subpoena. The Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Rights issued a formal request for Judge Chen to testify. He was cornered, not by activists, but by the very system he once thought he controlled. Declining to appear would signal guilt. Testifying could deepen it. Meanwhile, Karoline wasn't waiting for his response. She returned to the courtroom, not for a hearing, but to reclaim the space. Flanked by supporters, she stood on the courthouse steps and held up her cross necklace to the flashing cameras. "This symbol isn't a weapon," she declared. "It's not rebellion, but when freedom is threatened, it becomes a shield." The clip aired on every major network. Talk show hosts from opposite sides of the aisle debated the cultural shift. Late-night comedians tried and failed to mock her without triggering backlash. Karoline wasn't just winning hearts, she was shifting fault lines inside the courthouse. Judge Chen looked at his docket. A new case, another defendant, another robe to wear. But something had changed. The bench didn't feel high anymore. Karoline, meanwhile, made a rare move. She went silent. No new statements, no tweets, no appearances, just a stillness that left media producers and political operatives scrambling. Networks speculated endlessly, but in that strategic quiet, Karoline met behind closed doors with constitutional lawyers, and even to Supreme Court clerks. She was laying legal groundwork, building a federal religious discrimination lawsuit not just against Judge Chen, but targeting procedural failures across multiple judicial circuits. She wasn't looking for an apology. She was building a legal precedent. Then, the story took an unexpected turn. Judge Edward M. Chen, after days of immense pressure, released a public statement. "While my intent was not to violate anyone's religious rights, I now understand the harm caused. I regret the decision made in my courtroom that day. It was short, cold, and politically motivated, but it was something." And Karoline, she rejected it instantly. You don't get to erase harm with a press release. Accountability isn't a memo, it's change. That 23-word statement ignited a new wave of momentum, played over and over in slow motion on news channels. Karoline Leavitt was no longer a guest on talk shows or a subject of punditry. She had become something rarer, an archetype, the young woman with a cross who told a federal judge no, and the nation, even those who didn't agree with her politics, couldn't look away. By now, Karoline Leavitt had become a lightning rod. Journalists tried to downplay her rise as a momentary firestorm, but the data told a different story. Support across demographics, spikes in donations to religious liberty groups, and most alarming to the establishment, growing bipartisan sympathy. Then CNN made a mistake. They invited her. A balanced panel. They called it a segment meant to show both sides of the cross controversy. But Karoline had no intention of playing into a rehearsed narrative. When she stepped into the sleek Manhattan studio, dressed in a fitted white blazer and wearing the same silver cross Judge Chen had once fined her for, she was calm, surgical. Jake Tapper opened with what he thought was a neutral question. Some say you're inflaming tensions over a symbol. What do you say to those worried about division? Karoline smiled, not to disarm, but to aim. When a federal judge finds someone for wearing a cross, the division's already here. I didn't create it. I'm just refusing to ignore it. The panel froze. Tapper blinked. Producers scrambled to adjust talking points, but Karoline didn't stop. We've built a culture that says you can wear anything and express anything unless it's faith. Why is my necklace more offensive than a protest slogan or a pride pin? Why does my symbol come with a fine? Another panelist, a legal analyst, tried to pivot, but shouldn't courtrooms be neutral spaces free of religious influence? Karoline leaned forward, her voice steady. Neutral doesn't mean sanitized. The First Amendment doesn't stop at the courthouse door. And let me remind you, neutrality isn't real when it only ever silences one side. The interview went viral before it even ended. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Judge Chen's office had gone completely dark. He'd become a ghost in his own courthouse. And Karoline, she was no longer defending herself, she was prosecuting the system. By the time Karoline Leavitt arrived at the Faith and Liberty Summit in Washington, D.C., the narrative had shifted irrevocably. What began as a courtroom controversy was now a national movement. Over 12,000 attendees filled the converted arena, while millions tuned in online. Outside, buses lined the perimeter, not protesters, but supporters from across the country, many of whom had never been politically active before. And at the center of it all was her, dressed in simple white, her now iconic silver cross necklace shining under the stage lights. Karoline stepped forward. This wasn't a speech. This was a statement of reclamation. They said silence was safer. They said conformity would protect us, but they underestimated what happens when Americans are pushed too far. The crowd roared. Judge Chen, watching from a government-issued monitor in chambers, felt a chill. For the first time in decades, a federal judge wasn't seen as the authority. He was seen as the opposition. Her speech pivoted not just to defend faith, but to defend the right to defend. If they can fine you for wearing a cross, they can silence you for any conviction. This is bigger than me. This is about whether the Constitution applies when it's inconvenient. A national columnist called it the Gettysburg Address of a new cultural era. But Karoline wasn't done. She announced the formation of the Liberty Defense Alliance, a legal advocacy group focused on protecting students, workers, and service members punished for public displays of faith. Within hours, the website crashed from too many visitors. Donations topped $1 million before midnight. That same day, Judge Chen was issued a subpoena to testify before a bipartisan congressional panel. For the first time in his career, he couldn't hide behind the robe. Meanwhile, Karoline boarded a flight back to New Hampshire, but not before leaving behind a closing message. This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about who's next if I stayed silent, and I won't. She smiled at the reporters as she passed through security. No entourage, no campaign team, just a young woman with conviction and a cross they once tried to fine. 2 weeks later, the courtroom once again bore her name, but this time not as a defendant. Karoline sat silently on the plaintiff's bench as the hearing against Judge Chen commenced. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the nation was watching. Every media outlet had cleared space for post-hearing coverage. Social media had set countdowns. School teachers whispered updates in classrooms. The stakes were no longer personal, they were constitutional. Chen took the stand reluctantly, his posture stiff beneath the weight of the robe he once wore without question. He spoke in measured tones, legal jargon carefully layered to shield intent. But the truth had already escaped the courtroom walls. When Karoline's legal counsel presented photographic evidence, excerpts from the transcript, and video from the moment she'd been fined, a hush fell over the chamber. There was no yelling, no drama, just clarity, and when Karoline herself was called to testify, the silence turned reverent. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. "I stood there with a necklace," she said, "and I was told that was enough to be punished in the United States of America." She paused, letting it breathe. "If that's allowed, it won't stop with me. It never does." Somewhere in the back row, a retired judge wiped a tear. Hours later, as the hearing concluded, no final ruling was made, but no ruling was needed. The American people had already decided. That evening, on the steps of the courthouse, Karoline spoke to a crowd not just of supporters, but skeptics who had come to hear her and stayed to stand beside her. This was never about winning a case. She told them it was about reminding this country what it was built on and what it could still become. As the sun dipped behind the marble facade, Karoline turned to leave, pausing just for a moment. A little girl pushed through the crowd, no older than 8, holding a small silver cross necklace in her hand. "I wore it today for you," she said. Karoline smiled, knelt down, and whispered back, "Wear it every day for you." The crowd erupted in applause. She didn't ask for this battle, but she didn't run from it. And now, whether they loved her or loathed her, no one could ignore her. Not after what she did in that courtroom. Not after what she stood for, not anymore. They tried to silence her with a fine. They tried to shame her for her faith, but instead of backing down, she stood taller. She didn't just defend a symbol, she defended a principle. And in doing so, Karoline Leavitt reminded a nation, courage isn't loud. It's unwavering. This wasn't just her moment. It was a turning point, ***, and that concludes the powerful story of Karoline Leavitt, a testament to the unwavering spirit of conviction. Her journey reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can ignite the biggest movements. If this story moved you, if it sparked a thought or reaffirmed a belief, please show your support. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring narratives that challenge the status quo. Your engagement fuels our mission to bring these important stories to light.